As this solo from the overture to the opera Der Freischütz shows, Carl Maria von Weber had an affinity for the clarinet and loved to exploit the varieties of color, its dynamic range, and its adaptability in blending with other instruments. After forte chords in the horns, the solo clarinet enters with a sustained melodic line in a very full forte dynamic. Try to give the impression of strength and solidity without becoming forced and overly bright. The second clarinet joins in piano dynamic after a few bars, and then the solo line blends with the violins. An awareness of these various contexts can greatly enhance the overall musical impression, whether practicing the passage alone or actually playing it in the orchestra. Knowing the orchestral context as one practices the solo excerpts is so important that we will refer to it very often as we examine these examples from the standard literature. Of course, the best way of learning this music is to experience actually playing it in the orchestra. Since this is not always possible, study of the full score and listening to recordings can contribute to understanding the music. Actually, a combination of all these would be best. The passages we will examine in this recording are taken from the most standard literature for orchestra and could be expected to appear on the repertoire list of any orchestral audition. Of great importance are the symphonies of Beethoven, each of which has significant parts for clarinets. Here we will study excerpts from the 4th, 6th, and 8th symphonies of Beethoven. Bear in mind that while Beethoven indicated very specific metronome marks for each movement of each symphony, actual performance practice over the years has generally been to varying degrees a bit slower than written. While those attuned to the concept of more authentic performance are tending to more closely follow the written metronome indications, it might be better in an audition to be somewhat more traditional in interpretation. In the 4th Symphony Adagio, the first passage we hear is a wind tutti. Care must be taken to keep the inner pulse solid while maintaining an extremely legato line. Make the dynamic indication of crescendo followed by subito piano very clear. As we will see in these passages, Beethoven uses this device often. Be sure to feel a strong pulse and be very accurate in counting rests and longer tones. The detached 16th note passage in the 4th movement should be articulated as written, with a very quick grace note inserted. If a very fast tempo is taken, some slurs may be discreetly added. The solo, which comes near the end of the first movement of the Beethoven Sixth Symphony, must be well supported and well projected, as the surrounding texture is thickly scored. Do try to maintain the forte dolce indication by not using too heavy or too short an articulation style in the triplets. Take care not to make a retard at the end of the solo, as the music continues after that. Concerns in the andante include shaping the phrases convincingly and maintaining pulse throughout the long rests. Observe the dynamic indications faithfully. In the trio to the minuet of the Eighth Symphony, be aware that the dialogue between the pair of horns and the solo clarinet is accompanied by a triplet figure in the cello, so that a very steady pulse must be maintained with very little rubato. Again, those crescendi and subito piano indications are critical. Choose a secure, in-tune fingering for the final top G, which should be played very softly. Hector Berlioz was fond of the clarinet's ability to play extremely softly, and used this to great effect in the third movement of the Symphonie Fantastique. Not only observe the written dynamics, but follow the melodic contours to help shape the phrases. In the second movement of Brahms' First Symphony, a solo line in the oboe is taken over by the clarinet. The entrance must be unobtrusive, and once the 16th notes begin, they should be rhythmically very steady due to the rhythmic complexity of the accompaniment. Although this solo is written for the A clarinet, it is often performed on the B-flat instrument to avoid the slurs to the written high C sharp on A. The solo at the beginning of the third movement should be played with a full sound within the written dynamic, and the phrase groupings indicated by the composer should be carefully observed. The two solos for A clarinet in 9/4 meter in the first movement of the Third Symphony of Brahms should be played with a relaxed, waltz-like swing. Avoid hurrying the eighth note figures. The indications sottovoce and mezzovoce perhaps indicate a fairly intimate style, but should not be taken so literally as to make proper balance impossible. Follow the melodic contour with the tonal intensity and shape the written nuances very clearly. The opening of the andante must be played simply, as indicated, with emphasis on evenness of sound across the break and fine relative intonation. Observe carefully the written articulations. Some dotted 8th, 16th figures have slurs, some do not. Always play in a sostenuto legato style, however. In the second movement of the Brahms Fourth Symphony, inner eighth note pulse and the subdivision of the dotted 16/32 rhythms must be very secure. As in the Third Symphony, Andante, tonal consistency over the register break is critical. In the solo, which opens the scherzo of the Mendelssohn Third Symphony, the rhythmic stability of the legato 16th notes and the dotted rhythms that follow are important. Sustain the dotted notes well and place the 16th note precisely with direction toward the following beat. The syncopated figure at the end of the phrase can be played with a slight accent under the slur. Be really diligent in counting through the long sustained tones. All of the articulated 16ths should be clear and crisp. The passage before the coda of the fourth movement is a dialogue with the bassoon. Play in a very sustained style, observing the small crescendo and diminuendo indications well. The scherzo from Mendelssohn's Incidental Music to A Midsummer Night's Dream is often used in auditions as a demonstration of rapid, light staccato. The important considerations here include steady tempo, accurate rhythm, including longer tones and rests, and a clear, light use of the tongue. Beware of playing this too fast. The normal tempo ranges from about 80 to 92 to the bar. Bear in mind that sometimes the clarinet is an inner harmonic voice and sometimes the leading voice. Show the accents clearly, for example, beginning in the sixth bar, but without getting too far out of the piano leggero style. Keep a steady pulse and accurate rhythm. The solo in the third movement of the Rachmaninoff Second Symphony is a study in legato playing and breath control. Avoid any hint of agitation and choose breathing places very carefully. The interval of high D to high C at the end of the long diminuendo can be difficult. A trill fingering can be used if it can be made to sound in tune. The quality will usually be better matched with the regular D fingering, however. The solos in Rimsky-Korsakov's Capriccio Espagnol should be played in a brilliant, soloistic, and virtuoso manner, with clear articulation and firm wind support. Mentally organize the first passage based on the underlying rhythm of the accompaniment, da, 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 etc., and execute the trills clearly. The trills in the second passage, which are slurred into the first of two 16th notes, might be best executed as a double or 5-note trill to fill in the slur. In the B-flat clarinet solo in the third section, make sure that the 32nd note sextuplets are placed precisely on the second half of the beat. The quarter note triplets, which begin the cadenza in Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade, can usually be played related to the conducted 4 beats of the in-tempo first bar. Then the remainder of the passage is played freely, in usual cadenza style, beginning slowly, accelerating, and then slowing at the end. The second and third entrances can be successively stronger, and the fermata on the written B-flat held slightly longer each time. For the sake of ensemble, try to be very clear as to where the end of the cadenza comes and the orchestra re-enters. The pianissimo staccato solo in the third movement should be very controlled tonally and rhythmically, but the placement of the 16th note in the dotted figure can be later and freer rather than mathematically exact. Make the accents clear and avoid any unwanted accents, and shape each accented note with a quick diminuendo. The solo in the fifth movement should be even, clearly voiced, and with good rhythmic precision in the fingers. In the Semiramide Overture excerpt of Rossini, the articulation style should be very clear and crisp, with very close, quick grace notes and neatly clipped slur endings. The pulse, of course, should be very steadily maintained, but there is a tradition of a slight rubato on the octave D leap, which is made up by moving quickly enough through the following downward scale to achieve pulse equilibrium. The passage from the second movement of the Schubert Eighth Symphony is another study in dynamic control and integrity of legato connection. Pulse maintenance and accurate rhythm are also important. Use the wind flow gently, and in making the written dynamic change between pianissimo and forte, try to preserve an unforced and focused tone production. A strong awareness of the underlying eighth note pulse is essential in shaping the passages in the first movement of the Tchaikovsky Fourth Symphony. Be careful not to allow any undue pulsation or accenting in the sound when sustaining the many tied notes. In other words, count carefully mentally, but not physically, in the sound. It is usually necessary to practice the rapid 30-second note passages in the scherzo movement very slowly at first, to ensure coordination and rhythmic accuracy. The opening of the first movement of the Fifth Symphony of Tchaikovsky is scored for two clarinets in unison, and therefore presents certain challenges in intonation and ensemble. The dotted quarter and 2/16 rhythm, as in the first bar, must be played strictly in rhythm with a sustained but clear articulation style. Follow the written dynamics precisely. In the second movement, shape the first bar into the expressive accent on the downbeat of the second. Execute the 9-note trill precisely, perhaps dividing it 4 notes on the first half of the beat and 5 notes on the second half. The pianissimo staccato entrances in the first movement of the Tchaikovsky Sixth Symphony must be precisely on time. Make sure that embouchure and wind preparations are made well in advance of release of the first tone of this series. A strong concept of the pulse is important here. In the melodic solos, the emphasis is on beautiful, unforced tone and maximum legato connection between the notes. Airflow, unobtrusive use of the fingers, and finely tuned flexibility of embouchure all contribute to a seamless legato impression. The First Symphony of Sibelius begins with a solo clarinet accompanied by a quiet timpani roll. The mood evoked is perhaps one of loneliness and isolation and should be played in a resigned manner without agitation. The wind writing in Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun calls for tonal clarity and flexibility and attention to subtleties of nuance and dynamic shading. Be very aware of the underlying eighth note pulse in sustaining the longer tones. The 3/4 section begins with a solo clarinet line, which is joined by the flute and the oboe later. An equal blend of sonorities is ideal here, with no single sound dominating. Needless to say, legato, fine ensemble, and perfect intonation are important goals. Our final music for this recording is from Richard Strauss' Don Juan. Strauss' mastery of orchestration is always demonstrated by his ability to use each instrument most effectively, as these beautifully melodic solos demonstrate. Maximum legato and imagination in using varieties of color are called for. As we study these passages from the great works of the symphonic repertoire, we must keep foremost in mind the responsibility we have to the great composers to always do what we can to faithfully and accurately bring to life in sound the great masterpieces entrusted to us in their musical notation. Achieving as deep an understanding as possible of the proper style of each composer must go hand in hand with our technical ability to reproduce the notes. Reaching this balance of technical mastery and profound musical understanding, this mixture of intellect and intuition, is a lifetime endeavor which makes the musical life a rich and fascinating one. I invite you to join me in continuing to seek this goal.